Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
Without further ado, our good friends Bob and Betsy P. from Bellevue, Idaho.
How do I do that, Daddy?
Very carefully.
Thank you. Thanks, Corey. My name's Bob, and I'm a happy alcoholic. And thank you for all being archive-minded and coming out. And I think Corey has done quite an interesting and remarkable job of becoming so involved in the past of Alcoholics Anonymous, and not only here but elsewhere in the world, and sort of filling a little niche in people's knowledge of what went before. We were just talking about the biography by Sue Cheever that she did on Bill Wilson, and I think these other biographies have kind of sparked the interest in Bill, but here's Cheever, who did a very, very good biography, and I realized when I was all through with it that she had never seen Bill, she'd never talked to Bill, she'd never had anything to do with Bill. She was just a very good researcher. And I thought to myself, you know, I spent 9 years working with Bill Wilson, and not only that, but Bill and Lois lived in Stepping Stones, you know, in Bedford Hills, New York, and that was only about 25 minutes from where Betsy and I lived when I first came into AA, and for a long time afterwards. And so we did a lot of visiting back and forth. Bill and Lois almost always opened their home on any important holiday or other times, and would give parties, and Betsy and I were always there, and then they would come over to our house occasionally. Betsy will tell you about one visit with Lois Wilson, I'm sure. But anyway, to go back on my own situation, both Betsy and I were born in Kansas. She in Salina, and I was in Kansas City. And I'm a little older than she is, so we both went to the University of Kansas, but at different times. I was a little bit ahead of her. And we both, I'm a writer and she's an artist, and there was no jobs for us in Kansas in those two professions, and so we both individually beat it for New York immediately after we got out of the school. And pretty soon World War II came along, and I had gotten a job as a writer with a big company, and so I was at that time, of course, single. And what do you call it when they get everybody? The draft was really on my back, and so through another connection, I learned that, or they learned that the U.S. Navy, this is early 1941, and the Navy needed a professional writer in their public information operation down in Washington, and somebody recommended me, and so I was commissioned an ensign in the new U.S. Navy, but as a writer. And I wrote speeches for the admirals and the secretaries of the Navy, Secretary Frank Knox and Forrestal and others. And I also wrote a speech that Franklin Roosevelt delivered when the U.S. turned over some destroyers to our then ally in Russia. And I wrote a speech later for Harry Truman when he announced radar to the United States. You're all too young to remember that radar was a deep, dark secret until just at the end of World War II. At any rate, I had my first drink. I was a very slow starter. I had my first drink when I was about 18, my first real drink, and got drunk, and when I sobered up in the morning, I was fully clothed, lying in a bathtub in a friend's house, and feeling guilty and feeling bad and swearing to myself that I gotta never do that again. And that night we had a couple of double dates, and behold, I did it again. And as you know, as I read in the grapevine once, that whenever an alcoholic does anything once, it's a habit. And I think there's some truth to that, because that was the beginning of my first drink. I didn't drink too much in college, just the usual picnics and barbecues and going out with the boys and stuff. But when I came to New York, I got a job with a wonderful company, a very large company. It's Shell Oil Company, which is now the largest. They tell me it's the largest corporate entity in the world. What do you think of that? Consists of 600 Shell companies. Anyhow, the men that I worked with were older than I. I was 21 years old, straight from Kansas, thrilled to be working in New York, thrilled to be working on the 39th floor of the RCA building, where I looked down on all of New York. Oh my God, what a thrill. But there were older men that I worked with, and so they invited me. When I was only 2 or 3 days there, they said, would you like to come down to the English Grill and have drinks with us tonight? So this is after work, just have a drink after work. So that's what I did, and I got blacked out and ended up in Staten Island. How the hell I got to Staten Island, I have no idea. But we got back, and after that, I was basically pretty much a daily drinker in a very civilized way. But alcohol, boy, it's progressive as it can be. And pretty soon I couldn't answer the phone without having a drink. I couldn't answer the door without having a drink. And I remember another article, I think, in the Grapevine that said that it's understandable, that you might have to have a drink if a stranger comes to your door or something. But they said it's quite another thing to have a drink just in case somebody might come to the door. And that was where the situation I had reached, and completely dependent on booze. Of course, if you want to read my story, it's in the last story in the big book, as was mentioned here. But so today, I wanted to just tell you or share with you some of my impressions of early people in Alcoholics Anonymous, because there are there's just not much that has been written about some of these people, and they're all important. It's interesting. This is significant because, you know, AA had another international convention here in Toronto in 1965, and I didn't get to it. I was sober, but I thought, oh, I don't want to go spend a whole weekend with those losers. And so I didn't come, and I kicked myself ever since, because in that convention here, the international convention here, not only were Bill and Lois here, but Sister Ignatia and Dr. Bob had died, of course, by then, but other, you know, very important giants in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I had missed my opportunity to really be here and get to know them. So I've never missed an international convention since. The first one I went to was in 1970 in Miami, Florida, which was Bill Wilson's last convention. And I might just tell you a little bit about that, because he was sick then in 1970. You know, he had just a year or two before, he had been repairing the roof on his studio up in Bedford Hills, and had fallen off, and hadn't apparently injured himself, but his health deteriorated from that moment on, really. And I remember a General Service Conference that year. Of course, he was supposed to speak, and about 10 minutes into his talk, he said, "I just can't go on." And that was very unlike Bill. He loved to talk, and he loved to share, and he was very proud of everything to do with AA. But he just came and sat down. People were a little shocked, but you know, what the heck. Nobody really knew how bad it was, because his health continued to deteriorate. He was still able to take long walks and stuff like that, according to Nell Wing, who was very close to him in those days. So anyway, he was supposed to be, of course, on the agenda to talk down there in Miami, very much so. But they kept announcing at every meeting and so on that, well, Bill's upstairs and he's okay, but he can't make this meeting, maybe later. And that went on clear until the end of the international convention. And there were about 10,000 people there, and which was by far the largest collection of alcoholic members of AA ever, and up to that point. And so we were having our final meeting and in the ballroom of the hotel, and lo and behold, as we looked up on the stage, the curtains parted at the rear, and they wheeled out Bill, who was connected to an oxygen tank. But it was funny, because the host committee for that convention all wore outlandish, bright red sports jackets. And here was Bill in a bright red, bright orange sports jacket up there, and they wheeled him up, and he heaved himself. Of course, the place was a pandemonium. Everybody just went crazy. And he heaved himself to his feet and began to talk a little, and his voice was very strong, very good, but he spoke only very briefly. And at the end of them, he looked out over this big room, and he said, as I look out at you, he said, I know now that Alcoholics Anonymous will thrive or be alive for the next 10,000 years, if it is the will of God. And with that, he sat down, and of course, everybody was in tears and cheering and so on. And that was in July, of course, and by the following January, he was so bad, so ill, that they flew him again. He had a doctor down in Florida, so they flew him down to Florida, and that very night he died. That was in January of 19 72. And the only other things I want to share with you about Bill is that he didn't always agree with what the Board of Trustees wanted to do, and so he often had a cause that he was espousing. And by the way, I had first met him because I was a intergroup representative for my Greenwich, Connecticut group into the New York intergroup, because we didn't have any answering machine or any intergroup in Greenwich. And so I was the group representative in there, and I got to know one of the other men there who was he was a writer too, but he was in an advertising business, and he knew I was in the writing business, so he said to me, he said, I volunteer over on the Grapevine, and I find it, his name was Barry Leach, and he said, I just volunteer over there, and I find it very, very interesting to be associated with that magazine, and you might enjoy it too. And he said, I'd be glad to introduce you over there if you want me. And I said, sure, I'd like to. So he took me over to the General Service Office of AA, which was at that time on East 45th Street, where the United Nations is now. And he took me up in this loft building, and they rolled out the red carpet just like they do for every visitor in the General Service Office to this day. They really make you feel important because, after all, they work for you. And so one of the women there took me around and introduced me to everybody, and it just happened that that was the day that Bill was in the office. In his late years, he did most of his work in his studio out in Bedford Hills, but one day a week he came into his office in the General Service Office, and that's where he was this day. So as we passed the door, the guy just said, hey, well, this is Bill in here, Bill Wilson. And we just poked our head in, and he rose from the desk again, sort of unwound. He was a big, tall, angly guy. And he walked over and he stuck out his hand and he said, I'm Bill and I'm a drunk. And I said, I'm Bob and I'm a drunk too. And that was my total conversation with Bill that day. But I did start to volunteer on the Grapevine, and he used the Grapevine as a way of getting his opinions and his plans out to the fellowship, even though he might be sort of fighting the Board of Trustees on certain issues, like the one of the big prominent ones was the how the board should be divided between alcoholics and non-alcoholics. And up to that time, the majority had been non-alcoholics, and the minority were the drunks. But he was just dead set on the fact that the majority on the board should be members of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he was absolutely right, of course. And so that was finally brought about. But he wrote articles on that in the Grapevine in those days, and also talked about it whenever he was asked to talk. But in the General Service conferences, he attended them all, and naturally, and he of course the business just went right on. But he when he was not otherwise engaged, in the back of the room, this was pretty old stuff to him, so it was not uncommon that he would stretch out on the carpet in the back of the room and go to sleep while the conference was going on. And that's one vivid memory I have. And another is that Betsy and I were invited to a dinner down in Greenwich Village by Cora Louise Belford, who was one of the staff members in those days. And after dinner, we went out to her backyard, which was just a lovely wooded and flowered place. And Bill sat down on a concrete bench out there, and the rest of us just sort of sat around at his feet. And he always called it his bedtime story, and he talked to us for about an hour, just giving his own narration of his early days. And the same thing happened to me, by the way, when I got more active in service. I would attend the GSO Christmas party. They always had some sort of a party at Christmas time. And Bill, after the greeting and so forth was over, why, they would clear out the stenographic pool. Many of you are too young to remember that they used to have a stenographic pool. Now they got computers. But they took the chairs out of the stenographic pool and put a chair in the middle of the empty room, more or less empty room, and all the staff members and all the visitors, all the people who had come that day, quite a crowd usually, we would all sit on the floor around his feet, and he would tell us his bedtime story, or would make a talk to us. And that was those are my memorable memories of him. Now, if I keep on like this, we can all go home and you won't have heard anything about anything else. So I'm going to turn this over to Betsy, who was involved certainly in Bill and Lois, and she can share a little with you. Bets?
Okay.
Stick it on.
Is that right?
Yeah, speak up.
Oh. Well, I'm Betsy Pearson, and I'm in Al-Anon, and I've been married to this character for 60 years. and loved
Thanks to AA.
Yeah, and loved it. Yeah, thanks to AA. But we've had a wonderful marriage and a wonderful time in AA, and I'm so grateful for just being part of it and being able to share our lives with the AA fellowship and travel. And we were very fortunate in that Pierce, when he was at GSO, got invited to many countries to help start AA in foreign countries and set up general service offices and things. So we were invited to go to Italy and Spain and England and Iceland and New Zealand and Australia, and met people all over the world that knew and wanted to hear about Bill Wilson and how it started in America. And so it was a fabulous experience. But I had a very nice friendship with Lois. She was a darling person. She was some of you I'm sure have met her, but she was a very little tiny woman, pert and bright as she could be, and very good artist. She illustrated it, Lois Comes of Age, or wasn't the name of it? Lois Remembers, yeah. And she did the little drawings in it, if any of you have read it. And she was fun and loved to party and was just a really great friend. And one day she came over, and I took her to the yacht club for lunch. And we were sitting out on the deck, and the waiter came around, and he said, "Could I get you anything to drink?" And it was noon, and I started to say, "I don't believe so." And she said, "I'll have a whiskey sour on the rocks." And I looked at her, and she noticed that I was sort of, and she said, "That was his problem, dear, not mine." But I don't think she drank very much, if at all, but she sure did that day. She had a drink anyway. And we had them to dinner, and we lived over in Greenwich, Connecticut, in a big old Victorian house, and they'd come over and we'd get other AA people, and we had a big dining room, and we just had some wonderful times.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing. Taper Dave here. Just wanted to take a second to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you like what you're listening. I've got some very good talks here, and this one's a great one. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Tell me what you think.
Bill was a great, big, lanky guy. I remember especially his hands. His fingers were about that long, it seemed to me. He just had wonderful hands, and he used them sort of when he talked. He kind of went like that. But he was a great storyteller, and he loved to talk. But Lois was too, and she was really what held AA together. If it hadn't been for Lois, there would be no AA. He wouldn't have been alive. She really, she stuck in there. She didn't ever leave him, and she was right there for him. She pulled him out of situations and took care of him when he was sick, and thank goodness. What?
And the only one who worked.
Yeah, she supported him. He never, after he kind of went broke on Wall Street, he didn't have any money, so she and friends supported them more or less. But those were really the wonderful times, and we just feel so privileged to have had been able to be there when this was all happening. And I'll let you talk.
To enlarge on that, particularly in retrospect, I'm so grateful that I got sober when I did, which was when all of these giants of AA of the early days were still around, and also where I got sober, which was in Connecticut, which happened to be the third place where AA seed was planted, which I'll talk about in a minute. But also in New York, which is where the General Service Office was, and where consequently all the people, who were very active in those early days would come and call. I even met Ebby one time when he was coming through. Of course, later on he lived down in Texas for a while with Circe. And in the end of his life, he lived up in a place in Albany. It wasn't an institution, but it was with AA people who kind of took care of him until he died. But in the course of just being sober, when I did and where I was, I did meet all these people. And certainly one of the most significant in my life was the first woman to get sober in Alcoholics Anonymous, and that was Marty Mann. Her story, of course, is in the big book, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with her story. But she was a Greenwich socialite gal who married well, and she went to got the coming out party and stuff like that, and went to England with her husband and became a terrible alcoholic and was actually institutionalized when she was over in England. Then she came back to New York. She was in New York with a sister and other friends, and she was such a bad alcoholic that she was just too hard to handle even in New York at that time. And her sister, they came from Greenwich, Connecticut, so her sister took her out and put her into a mental institution in Greenwich, Connecticut. And the man who was the medical director of that particular institution was Dr. Harry Thibault. And I'm sure all you history-minded people know what an important figure he was in the early days of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's a long story, but a wonderful story of how a brother-in-law of Lois Wilson was a friend of Willard Richardson, who was on the staff of John D. Rockefeller. And so through that connection, Rockefeller became interested in Bill and the work that was going on in Alcoholics Anonymous. And he, of course, was the one who hosted the big party for all of his moneyed friends. Bill was practically salivating with the prospect of having lots of money and building a chain of hospitals and what have you. And of course, it was a famous moment. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was not able to come on that occasion, so he sent his son Nelson Rockefeller, and Nelson really delivered John D.'s talk. But Nelson is the one who said that praise AA for this wonderful philosophy or theme or the foundation of AA, which is that you help other people with no thought of reward for yourself. And the Rockefellers and many other people could hardly believe this, and they just did not think that was possible, that people would do that. and of course, Bill's hopes were crushed, and because what Nelson was saying is, all you rich guys here, don't give them any money, and they didn't. But anyway, now where was I? I get digressing from my digressions here. Yeah. Yeah, right. Talking about Marty Mann. And so through that connection, Harry Tebow, who was the man who actually sent me to Alcoholics Anonymous, he was, that's another story which I don't have time to share with you. But anyway, Harry Tebow, being a friend and I guess patient of the Rockefellers, they suggested that when the big book was published, that a previous copy, they printed, I think, 800 copies of the big book in advance and sent those manuscript copies to people like Harry Tebow, who were important people, and Bill wanted to spread the word among important people about Alcoholics Anonymous, so that's what he did. And Harry got one of them. And so most of the people, in fact all the people I guess, except maybe one or two in this institution, were mental cases. But a couple of them were alcoholics, including Marty Mann. And so he gave Marty Mann the this manuscript copy of the big book, and said, now, maybe these people are onto something, and it's really worth reading. You should read it. And so she took it, and as soon as her eyes, now this is all in her story, of course, but when her eyes fell on the word God, she threw the manuscript in a corner in contempt, because she was having nothing to do with God. But in a little while, as she was looking out the window, completely absorbed in rage and hate of her sister, who had put her into this place, she says in her story that she literally, everything that she saw was turned red by her rage. And she turned around, and there was this manuscript over in the corner, and she went over and picked it up in contempt and opened it, and she said her eyes, the first thing that her eyes fell on were the words, "We cannot live with anger." And she thought that was important enough that she went down and talked to Tebow about it. And Harry Tebow said, well, would you like to meet some of these people and meet Bill Wilson and Lois Wilson? And she certainly did. So this is in Greenwich, of course, so they put her on a train one afternoon. She trained into New York, and she was met by a couple of AA members from New York who Harry had arranged to meet her so that she wouldn't go to the nearest bar, see? So one of them took her by subway over to Brooklyn and to the home where Lois and Bill were living at that time, and where they had the first AA meetings in New York. And she was sort of terrified when she saw that there were only men there in this living room. So she ran upstairs, and Lois comforted her and said that they would certainly let her in and so forth. And so that's what she did. And so she attended this AA meeting, first woman ever to do so, and then went back out to Greenwich. The man who met her was named Popsy Marr, and Popsy was a guy that I knew quite well because we used to have lunch together. There was a sort of a luncheon group in New York, AA members who always had lunch together, and I was certainly a part of that group when I was working there in New York. So there we are. She got on the train, got out to Greenwich in the late evening, and was met by somebody from the sanitarium and taken there, and she was so full of what she had seen and heard that night that she went down to the only other alcoholic that she knew who was there, and they called him Grenny. I don't know his real name. I'm sure that any of you experts on AA history remember it. I don't. Anyway, she knocked on his door, got him out of bed, and she said, "Granny, we're not alone anymore." I can't ever tell that without tearing up myself, because God, that was suddenly the heart of the AA program. We're not alone anymore. And so she and Thibault started the first AA group in Greenwich, and that was, of course, the first AA group that I ever went to. I met this, of course, something much later on, but I met Marty, and at that time she had started the National Council on Alcoholism, and so she was very much involved in the whole thing. And she tried out some of the experiments and not following our tradition of anonymity and so on, but she was a tremendous figure in the whole business of alcohol. I'll tell you one more thing about her. In her much later years, she was ill, and she lived in Connecticut at that time, and this was in 1980, I guess, or around then. It was when we had the International Convention in New Orleans. So when was that? A while back. And Betty Little, a past staff member of GSO, who was there all the time, and I was there. She's here now. She's retired, but she came just yesterday, and we were with her most of the day. And Betty came to me, and she said, "You know, we've got to have Marty Mann down in New Orleans. It may be the last international convention she can ever come to." So we invited her, and she turned us down and said she just didn't feel she could make it, couldn't stand the crowds and so on. But Betty kept after her, and by God, she finally said, Betty assured her that we would meet her with a limousine and put her in a gold-plated wheelchair and take her around, which we did. And God, she was just a hit down there. I mean, there wouldn't be any women, you see, theoretically. There wouldn't be any women in Alcoholics Anonymous if Marty Mann hadn't started it. And so they all followed her around. She had an absolutely wonderful experience of getting a lot of perks and a lot of credit, a lot of gratitude and everything from people down there in New Orleans. And so it was a great success, really. And she came back, and a week later she died. But isn't that a wonderful, way to have sent her off, really? And when I came in, Harry Thibault, instead of giving me a talk about AA or giving me the big book, he gave me Marty Mann's Primer on Alcoholism, a great little book which has a chapter on alcohol, on AA, and that was my first introduction before I went back to Harry, and he called the man who became my first sponsor and sent me really to Alcoholics Anonymous. But anyway, Marty Mann was a very big figure all through in her life and mine. We started a couple of AA and a couple of other hospitals and mental institutions out in Connecticut, and in other ways she was still helping people all the way. Betsy, want to pick up anything?
I wanted you to tell him about Bob speaking in New Orleans, since we're on New Orleans.
Oh, yeah, that was sort of fun. Some of you I know knew Bob Smith, who was Dr. Bob's son. But what happened is that nobody ever heard of him really until the New Orleans International Convention. And we have the past delegates always have a big banquet at these international conventions. It was here last night over in the Holiday Inn on King.
I think we got a great talk going on here. Thanks for watching the channel. Taper Dave here. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom?
And several hundred people were there. And so I went to the one that they had in New Orleans, which was in the middle of the day. And up on the podium, they introduced Bob Smith. And he was from down in Texas, and he got up and said, "My name is Bob Smith, and I'm a member of Al-Anon." God, you could have heard everybody's jaw drop. You don't have an Al-Anon speaker at a banquet of past delegates. But he told about who he just went on, and he told a little about where he lived and little something to warm him up. And then he said, "I was the only person still alive who was present when Bill Wilson met Dr. Bob." Jesus, everybody in the house broke down with tears in their eyes and applauded him, and he told that whole story of AA's beginnings, really. And he was such a hit. We booked him in on the stage of the big meeting, probably 20,000 people before the convention was over, and he told a little there, and they just broke down in enthusiasm over him, and he was in demand as a speaker ever afterwards. He just died this last year, but boy, he was at every AA gathering from then on, and really a great figure. Thanks. Now, you want to say anything? What do we do here?
I'm going to add something to that.
Yeah.
We had his wife came back to.
Get it close.
Oh, his wife came back to speak in New York, I believe, and came out to stay with us for a night, and stayed a week. And we really had a great time with her. She was in AA, and she was very funny. She was really a cute gal. She's not living any longer either, but we got to know them very well, and it was fun because he told stories about his father and his memories of all this and alcohol in their family, and it was very interesting. Yeah, and is it time over? Oops,
No.
almost. Here.
I think one of the most important and fun figures that I got to know was Ruth Hawk. Many times when I'm talking like this, when I'm talking like this, I will say to the audience, "Who wrote the big book? Tell me, who wrote the big book?" Huh?
Bill Wilson.
What'd you say?
He said Bill Wilson, and he said Ruth
Yeah,
Hawk.
yeah, that's right. Well, actually, the person who actually wrote it was Ruth Hawk. She was the secretary in the office where Bill went with Hank. whatever his name was, who was the first pigeon, the first sponsee that Bill had in New York. And this was a guy who had a little business over in Newark, New Jersey. And so when he got sober, he had Bill come over and share the offices over there. And he had hired this, I think she was still in high school, a very young little gal, Ruth Hawk by name. And she came over and she had some funny stories about being a secretary in an office that was run by a couple of alcoholics. She said one time a man came in wearing a fancy vest and a derby hat, and he wanted to meet Hank. And so she, Hank said, oh yeah, send him in. Bill was in there also. And so he went in, and they closed the door, and she was working outside, you know, as a typist and so on. And she heard noises in the office, and so she went and peeked in the door, and all three of them were in there on their knees around the desk praying. She didn't know what to think. That wasn't in her job description, so she just closed the door and left them. But anyway, she says, and she tells this, and Bill tells this too in AA Comes of Age, that after they decided to write the big book, he would do his thinking and all at home usually, and when he came into the office, he would sort of have a mental idea of what he was going to talk about that day, and he would pace back and forth behind Ruth, and she would type at the typewriter, and he would just talk. He wasn't dictating or anything, he just talked. And so she would, and she said, and he said, after each page, treat God and how do you treat the religious idea behind AA in those days. And he said that when these arguments came up between him and Jim Birdwell, who was the guy who was on the more non-religious side, they would argue, and he said in many cases Ruth Hawk was the one who decided. And so one of those arguments was how should you treat God in the big book so that you don't scare everybody off, and that's how we got the words, you know, God as we understand him in the big book. She was even a hand in that. So anyway, she was a tremendously important person, though not an alcoholic, and she, you know, didn't go on too long in her role as a kind of a helper. So in 1975, I guess it was, we at our big, no, it was in Montreal. That was, yeah, when was Montreal? That was 75, I guess. Anyway, no, 80, that was 80. Anyway, at the International Convention in Montreal, we decided to give the 5 millionth copy of the big book to Ruth Hawk. We had invited Ruth Hawk to be an honored guest, and she was going to tell some of the things I just was talking about. And so here I was chairing that meeting, and here's this group of 50,000 enthusiastic people, and I make a little start to make a little talk, and I realized that we did not have the 5 millionth copy of the big book up on the stage. I didn't know where there was anyone. Neither did anybody else know where there was one. So I asked one of the staff members, I guess we'll be having dinner with him tonight. Haven't seen him in years, but we asked him to see if he could locate a book. So while we sort of marked time, he was scurrying around the stage more or less on his hands and knees, like somebody who's trying to not make a shadow on a projection, you know, like you do. And so he scrambled around, and finally he brought this book up, and it belonged to one of the people who were sitting on the stage. And so he handed it up, and with great ceremony, I presented it to Ruth. And afterwards, as that meeting was over, and as we left, I confessed to her that what we had done, you know, that this wasn't really the 5 millionth copy of the big book, and that was back at the office with a fancy, gold leaf cover and everything, and that I would certainly send it to her to see that she got it later on, and asked her, forgiveness for our stupidity. And she just laughed and she said, "That's so alcoholic." So that's all of Ruth Hawk. She actually, her daughter became a good friend of ours and visited us when we lived in Connecticut, and has a real link to her famous mother. Well, it's after 11 o'clock. God, I've got tons of people I'd like to talk to you about, but I won't hear you take it. Well, I will for a second. For example, Leonard Strong, as I told you, is the link between Lois Wilson, and hence between Bill Wilson, really, and the Rockefellers. And Leonard Strong, we had him as a honored guest at the International Convention in Denver, right? Yeah. And so we got to meet him. Sybil Corwin, gosh, many of you were at the International Convention later on. Which one was it? One of them. We had her. She was the first woman to join AA west of the Mississippi River. And she had a wonderful story, very colorful and fun, but no time to go at great length. Anyway, she went to the first meeting out there that had ever had a woman at it, and was scared to death that they were going to kick her out. But one of the guys who later became a trustee was a member of that meeting out in California, and he persuaded them to let her attend the meeting. And she said that very soon after, this was right after the Saturday Evening Post article, had been published, and there was a great flood of requests for mail, requests for help was coming through the mail. And so there was a bunch of them out there in California. And as part of this meeting, why they divided up all the mail and said, now, Joe, you take Beverly Hills, and Henry, you go to some other part of Los Angeles down there. And then he said, and here's a bunch from women, and he said, Sybil, you just take these and call on them. So with one meeting under her belt, she went around and called on all the people who had written in for help. And it was a wonderful way to help them, because she said, I don't know anything about Alcoholics Anonymous, but I do know that there's people there that are terrible alcoholics that are being helped. And if you want help, why, you ought to go too. And that was about her talk. And by God, she planted the seed, and an awful lot of people responded out there. And she later became head of the intergroup in Southern California, and very popular as a speaker. Spoke everywhere. It was sort of fun to hear her, because she would say, "My name is so-and-so, 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 Corwin." She had 5 husbands. And so she would give all those names, and then she would launch herself into her talk. But she was very colorful, and we had her at the International in somewhere, Montreal, I guess. So now if there's any questions or anything anybody you'd like to hear about particularly, and I've got many more in my hip pocket here, why, let us know. Yeah.
Why don't you explain how your story got into it?
Well, nothing, yeah. When I first came into AA, living in Connecticut, working in New York, I had a business trip down to Houston, Texas. And I went I went down in a plane, and when they came around and said, "What would you like to drink?" I said, "No thanks. I'll just have some coffee." And when I got down, and my sponsor in Connecticut, or New York, I guess at that time, he said to me, he said, "Now you're going to be a long ways from everybody, and people will want you to have a drink. Don't you do it." So I didn't. And he said, "When you get down to Houston, you look up AA and get to the first meeting you can get to." And I did that. I found out that there was a meeting going on that very evening that I got in. And so I took a cab and got out to this address, and the meeting was already well underway. But the man who was conducting the meeting and was saying, as I came in the door, he said, "You know, AA doesn't teach us how to handle our drinking." Jesus, that really got my attention, because for several months that had been my main occupation of my mind. And he said, "AA does not teach us how to handle our drinking. AA teaches us how to handle sobriety. And that's what none of us could handle. And that's why we drank." And my God, that was like a light going on in my head. It explained so many things to me. And ever afterwards, when people would talk about AA and, you know, why do you go to all those meetings and stuff, you know, I have to tell them that I hope that my drinking days are far behind me, but I've got to live, all of us do, every single day. And we got to deal with the frustrations and the disappointments and the people who let us down and people who we think wrong us. We got to learn how to handle all these things. And that's what Alcoholics Anonymous is really all about. I'm grateful to you for giving me the excuse to say that, because I try to say that at every single AA meeting. Particularly even to outsiders, you know, who don't know anything about AA. If you explain that to them, why they may understand it at least a little better. Reminds me of this, and again, some of you may know this, but one time a young gal said to, at a party or something, said to Bill, said, "Mr. Wilson, how does AA work?" And he said, "Very well, thank you."
That's it.
Okay.
I think we're clear.
Anything else? Well, thanks very much for having us here.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing. Taper Dave here. Just wanted to take a second to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you like what you're listening. I've got some very good talks here, and this one's a great one. Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, oop, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. I don't know if that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right. But I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.